So you've produced so much work on so many disparate topics, but is there a central thread that it's all sort of working towards?
I think almost all of my writing and work focuses on the life cycle of institutions, of organizations, their origin, with exceptional individuals creating completely new archetypes, completely new blueprints for how humans can be organized, through their maturity, whether or not they are functional or non functional, whether they achieve their stated objectives or not, and then eventually their decay and dismemberment, which inevitably happens for all human organizations, right? All human organizations eventually are absorbed, reintegrated, or just disbanded because they fail. And this is true at the smallest scale, like a company scale, or at the largest scale of entire societies and civilizations.
Okay, so that's on the surface, I think, very intuitively, very interesting. But I want to ask specifically to you, why does that interest you? Why is that interesting?
I think it's interesting to me because nearly all of our lives are spent moving through an institutionalized world, right? We go from school to work to, at this point, realistically, we seem to go into retirement homes. We don't even return to, family structure. But family structure itself is sort of very different society to society. So I think humans are a social species. And I can't help but be fascinated in all the ways we can be.
In the analysis of all these different types of institutions, because they sit across, whether it's a sports team, a big organization, a smaller community, what are, if there are any, sort of recurring themes throughout them?
I think one of the most important ones is that tacit, unstated knowledge pervades almost every aspect of human life. We learn so much implicitly, we copy so much from other people that we often don't even attribute it or remember it correctly. There's so many examples in sort of the human world of remarkable feats that are considered impossible, but once achieved are easily copied, right? Every time a speed record is broken for a sprinter or a swimmer or something like that, suddenly a dozen athletes find it within themselves to match that new record, where previously none of them could achieve it, right? And even in, how we come to be, right, when we're learning language and so on, we are imitating very profoundly our parents and other children around us. And I think that it is fascinating to me where these patterns originate from, right? Where do these human patterns originate from? And I think this is what is true at all levels of human organization. It's true for the individual, so the child. It's true for a field and what might the peak achievement of a field be. But sometimes entire societies copy a mode of being from one society into another, right? You have like the Meiji Restoration in Imperial Japan, where they basically transform their system of government, undergo industrialization, and so on. But honestly, even governments we might think of as anti-Western, such as the Chinese Communist Party, right? Where does that come from? Like it's obviously copying a sort of Soviet design, and its foundational thinkers include Marx and Engels and so on. Now, of course, this goes in all directions. All civilizations copy from each other, but I think this is why when truly different societies encounter each other, transformation is inevitable, right? And the transformation is usually somewhat lopsided, right? One side is transformed more than the other. So I think that is a very deep pattern that, any scale of human activity you look at, humans will be copying behavior, re-implementing behavior, repeating patterns, picking up patterns.
Tacit, unstated knowledge. Is that what you mean? Is that the imitation you're talking about?
I mean, it can also be explicit verbal imitation, right? It can be explicit knowledge. It can be mathematics. It can be written law. It can be music notation and so on. It's just that it's in the nature of knowledge that the vast majority of it is unstated. You can, of course, write down every step of the proof of a mathematical hypothesis. Like you can have a theorem be completely explicated in its proof. And even then, usually there are some things that are omitted by convention. But you cannot write down fully the problem-solving process the mathematician used to come up with the proof. So really, what is the more complex, right? The theorem or what produced the theorem? And almost always it's the sort of generative functions that are unwritten. This is as true in mathematics as it is in science, actually. If you go talk to scientists, they disagree with each other as to what the scientific method is in practice. And if you look at the philosophy of science or the theory of science, you will find something like 4 or 5 incompatible theories of why the scientific process works. Yet it works. Clearly, we have had a few centuries of very rapid scientific progress. Maybe it slowed down a little bit recently, and there are fewer fundamental scientific breakthroughs, even if, say, technological breakthroughs in computer technology and mathematics, applied mathematics and something like AI continues. Regardless, though, you don't need to fully state explicitly how a system works for it to work. Most human knowledge, I think, just actually, unsurprisingly, lives in human heads. The internet has done an amazing job of cataloging a lot of explicit knowledge. It's even made some knowledge that previously wasn't explicit. There are Olympic medalists who now train by watching videos of other Olympic medalists. So cheap, ubiquitous camera, lots of recording, made certain things that were once tacit knowledge, like, a particular highly skilled, like motor thing, anything from cooking to surgery, really, anything from, running to maintaining a machine. You can find a video how to repair almost any machine if you choose to, if you want to, right? And that is an example of a huge trove of implicit knowledge becoming, if not quite explicit, then at least documented, right? And searchable and indexable. But I think, there's no YouTube video of the mind. There's no YouTube video of a genius solving a problem. And if it is, it's basically fake, right? It's tracking the outside, not the inside. Maybe with Neuralink or other technology, this will change one day. But I wouldn't hold my breath for that.
So all of this human knowledge is living in the head, but the limitation is how it's transferred.
Exactly. And this fundamental limitation leads me to sort of the second pattern that is universal across human societies. The default is succession failure. Succession is like this, this problem that people are aware of in large organizations. I would break it down conceptually into, basically 2 components: knowledge succession and power succession. Knowledge succession is extremely difficult. How do you replace someone with a particular set of tacit knowledge with someone else who at least has comparable tacit knowledge? Even if we leave aside the problem of how do you create or educate or cultivate exceptional skill in any domain, you still have the problem of how to identify it. And so much of human structure has been around how do we identify exceptional human knowledge, right? You have the Chinese imperial exam system. You have the SAT score in the modern US. I feel like entire societies are sometimes turned upside down, trying to find talent one way or the other. A third example would be the Roman cursus honorum, where you're supposed to have a whole variety of political, military, and civilian offices on the way to being a consul, which was the supreme sort of position in the Roman state. So really, societies have tried very, very hard to find comparable human talent. Human talent is scarce. This sort of implicit knowledge is scarce. This sort of know-how is scarce. And all of these problems are only compounded by the fact that even if you succeed at skill or knowledge succession, right, this like component where it's like, is this person good enough to fulfill a necessarily specialized role? Specialization is also a fundamental feature of human society. It is impossible to have a complex society without complex specializations. So even if you have that succession of knowledge, often when someone enters a position, they will not have the same power, right? No one can say that Steve Jobs and Tim Cook are in charge of Apple the same way. They just can't be. Even if you have the same title as CEO, even if you work together for 30 years, so much of it is tied up in the personal reputation and track record of basically the founder who left and came back. So much of it is in all of these implicit things that, you know, Steve Jobs knew and built into the company. And finally, his unique and strange personality. So the power of a position can degrade over time as well. And I think people don't understand this as a problem. I think we tend to think of the problem being that, oh, individuals accumulate too much power and then they misuse it. But in our society, a highly bureaucratic society, and a bureaucratic society ends up becoming very oligarchic. The reason why Boeing sucks is because it is impossible for someone to come into Boeing and say, we're now going to fire 80% of the people. I know which 20% are doing the work, are doing good work, and then we're going to go around on a massive talent hunt. We're going to pour all of our resources into it, and we're going to find new employees. We're going to cut the thread on the dysfunctional company culture that's leading to these problems like poor plane design or a disconnect between the factory floor and the sort of engineering bureau that designs the planes that have to, of course, be made on the factory floor. So really, it's so difficult to fight a big organization. And if it's sort of like, if it's that hard to reform Boeing, right? If it was that controversial to reform Twitter, which note Elon Musk, I think, did successfully, regardless of what you think of the policies, and I certainly don't agree with all of the policies he instantiated, there were many people who were expecting Twitter to collapse when he fired 80% of the software engineers. It didn't, right? It didn't. And the key reason is he was probably a bit better than average at figuring out who actually had the knowledge needed to make the thing work. Meanwhile, a typical product manager actually might not, let alone a middle manager or a top manager, especially if their background was never in any kind of engineering, especially if their background was basically a Harvard MBA, right? There is something unusual about this hypothesis embedded into the American economy that management science overrides domain knowledge, that you're actually better off with not an engineer who spent 20 years in the company and got promoted all the way to the level of a Boeing exec, but that you're better off taking someone from Harvard. Now, I'm sure everyone from Harvard endorses the Harvard MBA, but then everyone from the Communist Party of the Soviet Union endorsed the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. It's just another name for central economic planning. All the same arguments you might use for the free market apply for company-specific knowledge, right? The problems, the price calculation problems, the discovery problems, the local knowledge problems, the stereotypical argument about the pencil, about how actually no one human being knows how to make a pencil because each component is like made in this specialized way, et cetera, et cetera. So really, I think that a lack of power capable of reforming institutions is a crucial problem in our society, because we live in this landscape of broken machines where all of the people are basically protecting their jobs, right? Someone wants to have a bigger team at Twitter, a bigger safety or something team. They hire 5 more people. They're now a much more important manager. They have more say in the board meetings, and then they climb the greasy pole all the way to the top. And it's the same problem at the Pentagon. It's the same problem at Harvard itself. And it's the same problem at every major organization. So we have had a failure of power succession where positions that are supposed to be ultimately responsible, like, I don't know, the president or the CEO of a major company, these are figurehead positions. And right underneath it, it's sort of this oligarchic structure.
How can the institutions that you do the research into, does that same 80-20 principle apply? Like, say, the Boeing example you gave, or at Twitter, where famously 80% of their staff left. Elon just asked them to opt in for being hardcore, and that sort of self-selected 20% people who just devote, the next several years, all of their attention towards a certain thing. So across all the institutions, how consistent is the 80-20 principle?
Let's say that it is the median number. I actually think that it's very common, but it's not universal. I think that what level or what proportion of people in an organization are actually oriented primarily towards the mission of the organization depends very much on how mature, how embedded, and how functional the organization is. So I don't think that I would give it as a universal rule at all, but easily a third of the organizations in the economy would probably run better if you only picked the right 20% of the people. The trick is, of course, in selecting them, and then secondly, being even able to do that, right? I think one of the incentives people miss is that modern CEOs of major companies sort of bounce between companies. So often all they have to do is make the company look good on the timescale of a few years, and then they jump to a different, extremely lucrative, extremely well-paid, high corporate position.
Same dynamic with any sort of politician that has a very narrow time frame to try and promise giant change.
Well, you can deliver nice things for your constituents, and then 4 or 8 years later, if the inevitable consequences arise, well, that's your successor's problem. They might even be from the other political party, in which case it is a feature. It is a feature to put landmines into the economy or the social structure so that problems arise 4 or 8 or 10 years from now.
And so now you've identified this, and let's just suppose it is true about it.
I think that we would do much better to have a society of smaller organizations that were more tightly run. So in other words, I actually think that if we had more organizations but were more comfortable with hand-picked succession in them, the balance of power that we believe is necessary to maintain a free society can happen between organizations more than within organizations. The mechanism to keep accountability and efficiency inside of one organization, these are very delicate mechanisms. They almost always break, and they destroy either efficiency or accountability. However, multiple organizations providing redundancy, providing competition, well, then there's a kind of accountability built into the system. It's much more robust. So as a society, I think we should be more in favor of just people, personally picking who replaces them in a position. This is like a really radical idea. It's sort of like, well, maybe it shouldn't be up to the university as to who is the next head of the, physics chair. Maybe just the current head of like the physics department picks their own successor. And then in some universities, of course, they're going to make this political choice and the scientific quality will suffer. But in other institutions, well, the cranky Nobel laureate physicist just picks another cranky, not yet Nobel laureate young physicist. And then we all benefit because that person's career is jump-started, right? And then that university truly shines. So I think we should be doing less to try to eliminate the tails of outcomes, right? We sort of, on this distribution, we've really focused on the left side of the Gaussian distribution. Really, we want to cut out all the cases of corruption, of incompetence. We want to lop that side off. But by lopping that side off, all the mechanisms we use like committees, devolution of powers, etc., they all lop off the right side of distribution as well. And we've done too much of this. And because of this, we are a society with less genius, less scientific progress, less cultural advancement than we were at certain previous points in time. And I'm not talking here about an absolute position of where we were, but sort of the speed, the rate of change, the first derivative.
You sort of touched on it at the end there, but this physics choice appointing the next figure or a middle or even large size organization was replacing the new head of a department or the new leader of the entire company. How do you solve for nepotism and corruption, which, is inevitably going to be whispering in the ear?
Well, let's put it this way. When you talk to an individual, you can explain to the individual why they are right or why they are wrong. When you are talking to a committee, you have to explain how you actually agree with them, even if all members of the committee disagree with each other. I think it is false to believe that a committee is not corrupt. In fact, a committee will probably owe favors to, well, how many committee members there are? 12 committee members? Okay, 12 different constituencies that favors are owed, and corruption or patronage must be dispensed to. The very arbitrariness, again, and this is in the context of smaller or medium-sized organizations, I think it potentially screens off a lot of this, a lot of these problems. And then the organization's reputation will be pretty apparent. So if you have dysfunctional nepotism, everyone knows that, the CEO's son is running the company into the ground. If you have functional nepotism, people don't even notice it. Like the New York Times, for example, most people don't know that it's a family-run business. Like the Sulzberger family have owned it and run it for 100 years. They have a development board, actually, where they take people who are not relatives, who are, experts. They work at the New York Times, and they go through the resumes of every member of the family, where the family members control the special class of stocks that can't really be sold, that basically defines voting, defines control of the organization. So they select among those members of the family working at other newspapers who seems most fit to run the New York Times. And they do a pretty good job. So that's an interesting mix of like nepotism and talent selection. And at the end of the day, they even justify their mission. It's sort of like they believe it makes the newspaper more independent, which might sound funny from our normal assumptions of society, but I would actually agree with it. I actually bet the New York Times would be a worse newspaper if it didn't have this like mechanism to focus it on, well, the benefit of a single family, but also the sort of independent public service perspective it's supposed to provide, insulating it sort of in a way from the tyranny of quarterly earnings.
Another dynastic family which you've covered, I'm here in Sweden. If you could just tell us maybe what the Wallenberg family have done so well.
I mean, it surprises people that Sweden would have a major economic dynasty. The country has cultivated a reputation as being, a very economically egalitarian, quote-unquote, moral superpower, I think the branding is. It basically, the country emphasizes its progressive credentials on immigration policy, on income equality, and its generous welfare state. The reputation's also validated by metrics like the Gini coefficient, which quantifies the level of income inequality in a country. And, Sweden ranks well on it. According to the World Bank, Sweden has a Gini coefficient of 29.3 in 2019. This is one of the lowest in the world. For reference, South Africa has the highest at 63, and the United States has a Gini coefficient of 41.5. But, while we have these measures showing high equality, it is still important to know that, in the Swedish context, family wealth is quite significant. Sweden's great families control large sectors of industry and commerce through asset holding companies, either directly or through foundations. In the European system, in most of Europe, actually, you can have nonprofit foundations own and advocate on behalf of for-profit companies that they own. And this is a common mechanism for basically industrial dynasties and family wealth to be transferred. In the United States, you couldn't have a nonprofit own and sort of advocate for a for-profit. Or if you do, you have to jump through some unusual hoops, like what OpenAI did. And that's partially one of the reasons that the United States has fewer industrial dynasties than, say, Germany or the Netherlands or, in fact, Sweden. You know, the Wallenberg family is by far the most prominent in Sweden. Its main holding company, Investor AB, is the most valuable publicly traded company in Sweden with a market capitalization of over 60 billion in 2022. That's equivalent to about 10% of Sweden's entire GDP. Now, for context, the only US company whose market capitalization exceed 10% of US GDP are Apple and Microsoft. So it's really a crazy and unusual situation to have such a dominant influence on the economy. The only thing that, in my mind, compares is the Kim family of the Samsung Group in South Korea, where the Samsung Group is like about 20% of the economy. But, you know, in our mind, saying that at the very highest level, Sweden and South Korea are about equally unequal is a counterintuitive comparison because of all of those other statistics that I mentioned that sort of apply to the middle class and the upper middle class and, let's say, the lower upper class. I think a lot of statistical measures of inequality actually mostly just measure inequality between the middle class and don't really capture the true extremes of the distribution. And this is a flaw of international statistical comparisons. Now, the Wallenberg business empire spans 5 generations. Andre Oskar Wallenberg founded it in 1856 by creating the Stockholm's Enskilda Bank. Could you correct me on pronunciation?
SEB, Enskilda.
Are you Swedish, Ryan?
No, but lived here long enough.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, you've lived long enough. You know Swedish culture. You've assimilated.
Slowly.
Perhaps you're a success story of that immigration policy I mentioned.
I don't know, Sam. I don't want to speak too soon. I think it's for someone else to say.
Yeah. So SEB is still one of Sweden's. It was one of Sweden's first major investment banks, and it is still a central pillar of the family wealth. They basically, as is true of many prominent families, members of this family have not been limited to business, but have also served the Swedish state as diplomats, military officers, and envoys. For example, Knut Agathon Wallenberg served as Sweden's foreign minister from 1914 to 1917. As you might imagine, that's during World War I, so particularly important time for a usually neutral country such as Sweden, right? Many opportunities, but also many dangers. There is an argument, I could go into all of this deeper family history, but the family's close relationship with Sweden's preeminent political party, the Social Democrats, has made them a critical part of Sweden's political economy. What do I mean by political economy? The economy of political action. One of the things people don't understand is that when you speak of political capital, you are talking in a way of real capital. There are favors traded, and different countries have different types of favor trading that allow their political system to work the way it does. In the Swedish case, I think one of the core things that has happened, and actually might best explain the theory of social democracy, like what is the esoteric or true theory or political economy theory of social democracy? I think it might be we as a society have been too destabilized by rapid industrial change. It has led to extremist views such as communism or fascism. This, by the way, is basically what happened in Europe in the 1920s or 30s. How do we address some of the problems without expropriation, right? Without expropriating the wealthiest, how do we address some of the problems that led to the social instability? Well, you implement the welfare state, you implement regulation, you implement taxation on income, and so on. In a way, you kind of flash freeze the economy. It becomes much harder to become very rich, and it becomes much harder to create a new company. However, you don't expropriate the companies, you don't nationalize the companies. Rather, you work with the companies to try to build a export-oriented economy. And if you read, Swedish government documents from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, they understood that the only way you could possibly fund this relatively generous welfare state was through having successful export-oriented companies. So in that sense, then, of course, the Swedish state has no interest in expropriating the Wallenbergs. If they did, they understand these would have to be state-run companies. And if they were state-run companies, they would be much more inefficient. And if they were much more inefficient, they couldn't compete internationally. And then total revenue for the state would go down. So in that sense, the sort of a social democracy as a way to preserve old industrial money, if you use that as a shorthand and as a heuristic, and you look at Sweden, and you look at Germany, and you look at even places like Austria, it just makes a lot of sense. It looks like that's what it's for. And isn't that different from the normal story where social democracy actually creates equality for everyone? It's sort of like the incumbents partner with the state to avoid expropriation, and in exchange they sort of fund the state's political project of the welfare state.
Yeah, it does fly completely in the face of the international reputation. Last year, a journalist here called Andreas Savenka wrote a book called Greedy Sweden, where he was just breaking down big time how it is the case that Sweden has the most billionaires per capita, and how there's no wealth tax, no inheritance tax, and essentially, although the income tax for the great majority of people is as high as it'll be anywhere else on the planet, turns out Sweden's a phenomenal place to be if you're in the top 0.001% of the wealth distribution. But specifically so they're into their fifth generation, and this is what you wrote of the Bismarck Brief. Like, the whole point of you writing about it is that you're someone who is studying great institutions. So what is what do you want? What's necessary for us to know? What's significant about them being able to?
Basically, the significance here is that the companies are in a way shielded from being directly the plaything of the Swedish government. So in a way, you might not think of it as a kind of checks and balances system, but in a way it is, right? If there's a concrete family or several families that own various industrial fortunes, and they're sort of at this semi-fighting, semi-colluding with the government, this is actually still a better situation than a fully nationalized business. With regard to the Wallenberg family, the interesting thing is that they are not just rentiers, so they're not just people who own the company and sort of enjoy their wealth and outsource management to others. The notable thing is that many of them are actually CEOs. So I am in favor of ownership belonging to those who manage. I am not in favor of separating ownership and management, even though that's a big building block of the modern American corporate economy. But I think it is leading to it being deeply mismanaged, right? And at first, the problems are minor, but there is a severe principal agent problem that I think is never resolved, right? The principal agent problem is when you hire someone to do a job that you care about, you can't hire them to care about the job. You can only hire them, for what you're paying. You can give them money so they care about the compensation. They care about what you perceive as to whether they're doing a good job. They don't necessarily care about whether the function's being fulfilled. And I think that companies, after multiple generations of a separation between ownership and management, result in this kind of decay and breakdown, which becomes a big problem if they're making complex products such as, Boeing's airplanes, or honestly, something like ASML. If you handed over the Dutch firm ASML that produces, the optical components that are needed that are needed in the chip fabs of TSMC, I think the company would start breaking down very soon, and would probably be displaced by a Chinese competitor. But just to finish sort of the discussion of the Wallenberg family, right? Back to Sweden. One of the more interesting things is that the sixth generation of the Wallenbergs is set to take over in about 10 to 20 years. There's, a candidate list of up to 30 under 30s in the family. In line with the structure of the family empire, none of them can expect to take a majority of the family's wealth. And the talent pool is expansive enough to likely avoid, a poor generation. So I think that they have succeeded at basically having a wide enough talent pool to avoid complete succession failure. But it is inevitable in the long run, as all dynasties do, that they will basically lose power to their own employees. We could honestly joke about this a little bit and say that isn't the British royal family a great example of you hire someone to do the job for you, and eventually they just know everything about how to run the company, and they really have control. We could joke that, Britain is a bureaucracy pretending to be a democracy, pretending to be a republic, pretending to be a monarchy. In that sequence, right? You have like sort of the unelected, unaccountable civil service that pretends to respect things like the Brexit referendum, which honestly, when it works, it really annoys them. They really hate it. That then sort of pretends to be restrained by this kind of like House of Lords and parliamentary supremacy structure. That then, of course, pretends to be, underneath the sovereign, right? The King and Queen of England. It's rather typical to have layers, like it's not so much form of government. It's almost like sedimentary layers of government, right? And even in the United States, you often have this friction between judicial authority, democracy, the intelligence community, any sort of remnant capitalism that still exists, any sort of remnant FDR socialism that still exists. And these layers sort of compounding together form the like real geological strata of government. And because of this, I feel like it's very difficult to cross-apply lessons between different societies. What might work in one society, because it is balanced by other forces, could prove absolutely catastrophic in another. I find it very interesting that the United States, which is a high inequality society, it is easy to earn money, but difficult to pass it on. And Sweden, which is considered a low inequality society, it is, it's hard to earn money and easy to pass it on. Like these are two very different architectures.
Regarding what you wrote on the Wallenbergs, did you ever have correspondence with them? Do you know what they made of your analysis?
I don't know directly, but I contacted several people in Sweden basically getting additional information. They were an excellent case study because I have been trying to figure out various mechanisms to solve succession. So I looked at a lot of the big dynastic structures around the world. Like I looked at the Kim family that has the Samsung Group. I looked at the Sulzberger family, and I looked, in New York, who owned the New York Times, and I looked at the Wallenberg family in Sweden. And I also looked at other mechanisms, right? Like I looked at the French Polytechnic schools, and I looked at the U.S. Ivy League system, and I honestly feel that we underutilize case studies. I think when today we do social science, we want to rapidly go for statistical measures such as the Gini coefficient, and we underrate the value of well-done deep case studies, because often, statistics are just, any given statistic is just a thin slice of what's going on. And of course, it should inform you, but it is in a way a tool. It's like a synthetic construct. I think only by closely studying deep, concrete cases will we get a better theory of human social behavior, of human political institutions. And yes, this involves cold emailing people, and sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you interview them just for your paper. not even as a journalist, but just to figure out what's going on, right? The Bismarck Brief, at the end of the day, is a sort of private intelligence newsletter, right? We release some of the briefs to the public, but we have a solid subscriber base precisely because they understand that they will get once a week a deep case study, almost a profile of whoever they're interested in, right? It is this sort of thing where I don't think mainstream media does this, and I don't think academia does this anymore. But people who care about where to invest, they're happy to subscribe to such an information.
Absolutely.
product.
That's truth in advertising right there, Samo. It is the most cliche to say, but sort of high signal, low noise ratio email you could ever sort of receive. Regarding the case study, that's an interesting point as well, to say that you would almost maybe not value it more, but find it almost as reliable or as effective to understand something as the statistics. Because although they might be messy, there might be a deeper truth inside at the bottom of that case study. For instance, as you've explained, the case study of the Wallenberg family will help you to understand Sweden far better than just simply measuring its Gini coefficient and maybe what the median income is. It turns out a group of 11 million people are a little more complex than just a couple of statistics.
Well, I think the very similar statistics can be very different economies, right? If we had two countries that had the same GDP per capita, and one of them, half of their exports were, carbohydrates, right? So oil and gas, and the other countries, half of exports were semiconductors. These are two very different countries, even if they had the same GDP per capita, right? And I think that there's something similar true of every statistic. The US and China, the average age is actually about the same. So the average age of workers is actually about the same. However, China has a much smaller, younger generation. So actually we're seeing China will age much faster than the United States will age. But many people are surprised because they expect China to already be old. But it's not currently old. It just will become old very rapidly. And the US, mind you, after the pandemic, now has a much lower fertility as well, has kind of a European tier fertility, though people have not yet figured that out. So even the US will undergo a slower aging than China, but a real aging. So there is always a next clarification or a next step. Even what I just said about fertility, we could say a few more sentences on how that picture is different if you break down the United States to different regions, or if you look at immigrants versus people who were born in the United States and so on. There's always a deeper truth, and it can never be captured by a single number. In fact, when statistics are used well, they are used as part of a reasoned analysis. They are never just a number that stands on its own. It is misleading to use numbers in that way. And we used to understand this much better, I think, 60 or 70 years ago, possibly because we expected more of statistics. I think in the 1940s and 50s, they really believed that statistics could be used to rapidly gauge society, measure both public policy, but also drive company decisions, increase production. This was all considered to be part of this ever more rational, ever more advanced future. And I think to a great extent, we are almost postmodern with how we treat statistics. People are happy if you just spew numbers. People are happy if you show clever things with your numbers. They don't really care if the analysis makes logical sense. And I find that deeply disturbing. And I find that that is an example of how our academic and public intellectual culture has retreated from numeracy, right? It's sort of like, I imagine peak numeracy of public discourse was probably, 1982 or something like that. I think that was the year when you had the most accurate use of numbers in public discourse. And you would match the proportionality, right? Every time you deploy a statistic to demonstrate something, it's basically a heuristic there. Every statistic is a heuristic. Every statistic is a rule of thumb. If you think of them that way, you will be practicing, the epistemic equivalent of defensive driving, and you won't be so easily swayed. And if everyone did that, I think the public institutions like the New York Times would respond to the changed incentive landscape, right? They would change their information product because the customers demanded more.
Samo, just time check. I've got you for 8 more minutes.
5 minutes. We can totally do 5 or 10 more minutes.
Okay, then let me rapidly and disturbingly triage a few of these questions away. And we'll just finish with a few, 3 that I ask every single person, so that you'll do them quickly. But then one which I really wanted to hear you open up on, if you could. But just, how has Nassim Taleb informed your worldview?
I think Nassim is he'd be offended to be called one of the best public intellectuals in the world. But I think he has been a very talented troublemaker where he upsets financial orthodoxies. It is important to have people like Nassim who are independent in this like economic sense, but also the social sense, so they can pierce sort of these bubbles of pretension that build up in various fields. So I think Nassim, I think his book Black Swan was wonderful, and I think he demonstrated a lot of what could be done and what could be shown when engaging deeply with a field of knowledge today that is powerful, that is influential. Because at the end of the day, a finance orthodoxy isn't just a scientific hypothesis about the world. It is also a political statement. And it is a claim of, this is how we're going to distribute resources. And this is why how we say resources should be distributed is rational. And this is why, you see, actually, I did not commit financial crime even though I enriched myself, right? So it might not seem like by every claim of these sort of orthodoxies, it's like 50 careers depend on every single claim, right? And that's why it's like one of the fields that is, I think, very obscurantinist. Finance goes out of its way to obscure itself.
More specifically, if you don't mind, how has Nassim Taleb the worldview? How does he influence the way you think? When does he come to mind when you're writing?
I think the most specific way that I found Nassim influential was just his sort of, just the book, The Black Swan. Sort of outliers exist, and there's some probability of these outlier events or surprises. And I think that would be the most specific influence.
Worries.
I think I've mostly not directly built on his work, but I have been informed by it. But as I described, I really admire his approach to thinking about problems. He's like a bit of a epistemic troublemaker, and I really like that. It's sort of like questioning questionable constructs.
Totally.
Is something I deeply appreciate. So, yeah.
And some other great thinkers or authors that have particularly shaped your worldview?
I think that there are some who, you want to endorse the good book. You don't want to endorse their other work necessarily. So I'm just going to say that, like, when it comes to thinking about natural selection in the world and how mechanisms come to be, I would recommend The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. I think it is actually a very good book. I think it's much better science than, or honestly much better literature than a lot of his other books, which I wouldn't necessarily endorse. I would endorse a lot of books and thinkers who have advocated for a classic humanist education for the purposes of understanding the human being. I think that, How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler and his entire approach to sort of engaging with the Western canon of literature, so all his other works, were invaluable to try to have a guide towards finding, sort of the peak of human achievement and reasoning in a given field. I think of other books that I would recommend Carroll Quigley's The Evolution of Civilizations. So I think his thinking on sort of macro structure, big history, that also influenced me quite a bit.
And what is the role that serendipity has played in your life?
I think, you create your own serendipity. Almost every situation in which you exist is more a superposition of things it could be, and you're always collapsing the superposition into something or the other. So I think, yes, serendipity has been deeply important in my life, but I would be lying if I said I didn't seek it out and I didn't make serendipity happen in a way.
Absolutely. I mean, you're a Slovenian in San Francisco. Clearly, you are seeking, the maximum serendipitous outcome. But more specifically, what role has it played? Is there a particular moment in your life, as that question comes to mind, of a fork in the road that had you not been in that place at that time, you would be here right now. You wouldn't be writing Bismarck Brief.
I do think that there was a critical period sort of in my early 20s where a slightly different set of friends or mentors would have convinced me to sort of stay in academia rather than leave academia and pursue this independent path and, produce this academia adjacent sort of approach to research where I run my own firm and, that's how my own consulting firm, and that's how I study politics and economics and all of that. And I do that for clients and I do that for subscribers. I could easily imagine having been persuaded to go, I don't know, to LSE, for example, and become an economist or something like this. And I think that I probably wouldn't have left to that. I would have probably just been stuck there. Right. And I would have probably had some heretical ideas, but I'd never have a reason to really develop any alternate frames of thinking to a great depth, because there would be no career reward to do so. So yeah, I think that's it. Had I not been encouraged to try to make my own way by friends and mentors in my early 20s, I think I might have just assumed that no such thing is possible. And I would have been in academia, in the Sisyphean effort to do research while at a university, right? Which, if you do research at a university, you know how much the paperwork gets in the way of actual research, like all the grant writing, all the teaching, etc.
Well, Samo, there's so many more things I'd love to ask you. I mean, you sort of just opened up there. A great follow-on would have been how you see the media landscape over the next 25 years, your role in it, etc. But nonetheless, we'll close on this question every guest has had. What is a country that you're particularly bullish on?
I would say that I'm relatively bullish on Poland. I think that a little bit due to German decline, but a lot due to Polish growth, Poland will eventually be a richer country than Germany. And I think that would surprise many people. Yeah.
Germany's still the largest economy in Europe, right? So you're saying Poland will become?
Yes. And I think, of course, Germany is dealing with a stupid energy policy, right? And also an energy policy where they have put themselves to be exposed to international pressures. Let's remember, buying natural gas from Russia is not the worst decision. But when someone blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, then it kind of is the worst decision. It left you maximally vulnerable. You have no leverage over Russia. You have no leverage over whoever blew up your pipeline. Probably the United States or some of its allies. I don't know. Germany certainly doesn't have leverage over them. And the green policy has resulted in giving massive subsidies to the Chinese solar cell industry. It's the Chinese that actually built the world's photovoltaic. So it's not even like the green transformation, the low carbon economy. It's not even like that went to German companies. That just went to, in a way, Germany's biggest industrial partner, but also its biggest competitor. So Poland has cheap energy. It has alleviated its demographic problems significantly due to, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine, right? The Russian invasion of Ukraine produced a massive refugee wave. There are now millions of Ukrainians living in Poland who I think most of them are never going to leave. And the Poles are basically fine with that. And even immigration from other parts of the planet, you might have heard of Poland as being sort of like anti-immigration from the Middle East a few years ago. In practice, their most recent governments have accepted immigration from India and from the Philippines. And they are, of course, still trying to raise fertility. So I think labor will remain abundant in Poland, energy will remain cheap, the economy will be more capitalist and less regulated, which is true of a lot of Eastern Europe. Because of their experience with communism, a lot of these countries have gone about as much in the opposite direction as you can. The Baltic states, I believe, some of them have a flat tax, so they don't have progressive increasing taxation. They just have, you pay 20% or 30%, and that's just the one tax bracket. That's it. And many of them, like, say, Estonia, have a lower, something like a 50% lower ratio of, let's say, bureaucrats per capita or government employees per capita. They still have, at times, generous welfare transfers, but just way fewer government workers, right? And, this is because they really seized on, in Estonia's case, on digitalization. For Poland, they've successfully created basically a middle-class society with a lot of medium-sized companies. And the reasons to be optimistic is that there is no fundamental barrier to Poland having truly large companies. The political economy, of course, will change away from this sort of like middle-class, libertarian-ish equilibria as you have the truly large companies, and it'll have to be some sort of state export partnership like what South Korea has with Samsung, or say what Sweden has with the Wallenberg family and other families. But I don't see any fundamental reason Poland couldn't do this. The only real thing that could stop it is if there were onerous EU regulation targeted at favoring incumbent French and German companies and sort of crippling Polish companies. But I think that will be resisted. So I think that will not be as successful as some of the incumbent companies within the European market might wish.
Love it, Samo. Just close for all the Polskis out there. Thank you for being so generous with your time today, offering an hour of it. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, a pleasure being here with you.